Ecco, benissimo. Allora, buonasera a tutti, and good afternoon, good morning for those of us who are following it from the United States, and well, good night for those who are following us from Japan and Korea. It's a great pleasure to host the very first IAS lecture here at the Royal Gardens of Capodimonte with Jesse Locker, a distinguished speaker who will be introduced by the authorities of the Italian Art Society and the O'Donnell Center here at the Royal Gardens. I would like to thank especially Dr. Antje Gamble, the president of the Italian Art Society, who is not here today in Naples, but she is following us from the metaverse, where she is located right now, but also Kelli Wood, the deputy president, who is here physically present in Naples today. I would like to also thank the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, who made this all possible, and especially Lisa Schermerhorn, the interim president, as you all know, and we are thinking of her, of course. Julie Alexander, the president a few weeks ago, suddenly left this world. A third institution I would like to thank after the Italian Art Society and the Samuel H. Kress Foundation is our very own Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History and Art History Center and Architecture of the port cities La Capraia, with the President Sarah Kozlowski, to whom I will pass the microphone straight away. Please, Sarah.
Grazie Direttore, buonasera a tutti, grazie della vostra presenza stasera a Capodimonte e online. Da parte del Centro per la Storia dell'Arte delle Città Portuali alla Capraia sono lieta di presentare, con la partnership del Museo di Capodimonte, la conferenza annuale della Società per l'Arte Italiana, the Italian Art Society, e la Fondazione Samuel H. Kress, quest'anno tenuta dal professore Jesse Locker. La Capraia, il nostro centro di ricerca nel cuore del Bosco di Capodimonte, è stato fondato nel 2018 come partnership fra il Museo di Capodimonte e l'Istituto per la Storia dell'Arte Edith O'Donnell presso l'Università del Texas a Dallas. I programmi, come quello di stasera, fanno parte della missione del centro, ovvero quella di mettere insieme gli studiosi e le opere d'arte in situ qui a Napoli per porre nuove domande e creare nuova conoscenza nel campo della storia dell'arte. I nostri programmi, progetti e ricercatori partono dal Museo e dalla città di Napoli come laboratorio per nuovi approcci di ricerca alle storie culturali delle città portuali come luoghi di incontri, scambi e trasformazioni. In questo modo la nostra ricerca è fondata sul contatto diretto con oggetti, siti, collezioni e archivi di Napoli e dintorni, e allo stesso tempo mette Napoli nel contesto più ampio delle storie culturali globali. Stasera, con la conferenza di Jesse Locker, entriamo nel mondo dell'atelier di un pittore napoletano del Seicento, un artista che prende il nome di maestro dell'annuncio ai pastori da un dipinto del cuore della collezione del Museo di Capodimonte, esposto oggi al secondo piano a qualche passo da noi. Il professor Locker sarà presentato dalla vicepresidente dell'Italian Art Society, Kelli Wood. Ma prima di passare la parola a Kelli, due parole di ringraziamento. Innanzitutto grazie al direttore Eike Schmidt e lo staff del Museo di Capodimonte, in particolare l'ufficio del direttore, per l'accoglienza e per la dedizione alla presentazione della conferenza di stasera. Grazie all'Istituto O'Donnell, con Capodimonte l'altro genitore, e della Capraia, e grazie come sempre a Francesca Santamaria, coordinatrice del centro. Ringrazio naturalmente la direzione dell'Italian Art Society, in particolare la Presidente Angie Gamble, la Vicepresidente Kelly Wood e la coordinatrice Arlene Lees, così come Sarah Wilkins e Tenley Bick. E ringrazio la Fondazione Kress per il loro sostegno a questa conferenza e la loro dedizione allo studio della storia dell'arte europea dall'antichità al Novecento. Siamo onorati di accogliervi a Napoli e di ospitare la conferenza Italian Art Society Kress Foundation al Museo di Capodimonte. And last but not least, I thank Jesse Locker for joining us here at Capodimonte and for sharing his work with us. To introduce our speaker, I'm delighted to present my colleague Kelly Wood, Assistant Professor of Art History at the University of Tennessee and Vice President of the Italian Art Society. Grazie.
Grazie mille. E signore e signore, ovviamente sono lietissima di essere qui con voi oggi e è un gran onore di presentarvi il nostro speaker, dottore Jesse Locker. Ma prima, the Italian Art Society fu fondata nel 1987 e fra quel punto è diventato una delle più grandi organizzazioni professionali dedicato solo allo studio dell'arte italiana, dall'antichità al giorno presente. E abbiamo quasi 400 soci e grazie mille ai soci che sono qui a Napoli oggi e anche su Zoom, specialmente il nostro presidente Angie Gamble. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be with you today, and it's an honor to introduce Jesse Locker, our speaker. The Italian Art Society was founded in 1987, and since then it has become one of the largest organizations dedicated solely to the study of Italian art from antiquity to our present day. We have nearly 400 members. Thank you all who are here in the audience today, and also who are joining us on Zoom. Ogni anno the Italian Art Society promuove l'arte italiana attraverso attività diverse come borse di studio, come riunioni, sessioni di conferenze, un premio per un nuovo libro benemerito e l'evento annuale del Kress, iniziato 14 anni fa. E rendiamo grazie alla Fondazione Kress e ai nostri colleghi qui a Capodimonte e alla Capraia. So each year, the Italian Art Society promotes research on Italian art. We have fellowships for scholars, we have dedicated conference sessions and meetings, a prize for a distinguished new book each year. So I'm asking you to join, if you're not already, and of course, the Kress lecture that we're here for today, 14 years ago, which began in Rome with the first lecture by Herb Kessler. And so thank you so much for everyone being here. And thank you to the Kress in particular for their continued support. Allora, sono onorata di presentarvi il dottore Jesse Locker. Locker è laureato dall'Università di Johns Hopkins e ora è il professore dell'arte italiana rinascimentale a Portland State University. Il suo primo libro, Artemisia Gentileschi, il linguaggio di pittura, pubblicata di Yale in 2015, ha vinto da Choice il titolo di un libro accademico eccezionale e ha vinto anche un premio Helen and Howard Marano from the Society for Italian Historical Studies in 2016. Il lavoro di Locker ha avuto un impatto molto importante sulla storia dell'arte rinascimentale, soprattutto con le pubblicazioni che hanno raggiunto un vasto pubblico, come il volume titolato Arte e Riforma e anche con saggi su riviste molto importanti. An alumnus of Johns Hopkins University, Locker currently holds the position of full professor of Italian Renaissance and Baroque art at Portland State University. His first book, Artemisia Gentileschi, The Language of Painting, published by Yale in 2015, was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Title and won the Helen and Howard Marano Prize for the Society of Italian Historical Studies in 2016. His work has made a significant impact on Italian Renaissance art history, with publications reaching broad audiences, appearing in venues such as the Apollo magazine, such as Source, Gastronomica, the Bulletin of the Prado Museum, and in Food and History, as well as Artibus and Historiae. Il suo prossimo libro, The Material World, of Early Modern Italian Artists. Esamina il mondo materiale degli arti all'inizio dell'età moderna, un argomento che è costruito da prove come le cose che furono possedute dagli artisti, tipo libri, figure di cere, oggetti di legno, oggetti di scena, eccetera, che furono documentati negli inventari e testamenti e anche nelle loro pitture. Artisti come Caravaggio, Artemisia e Guido Reni. So Locker's upcoming book project, which we're excited to have a small preview of today, The Material World of the Early Modern Italian Artist, examines the material world of early modern artists based on the objects that they owned. So we're excited to hear about that. So, oggi abbiamo il gran piacere di ascoltare a Locker, che parli di un artista con un'opera qui al Museo di Capodimonte. Allora, do un benvenuto a Locker. So, thank you. We're going to have the pleasure of hearing Dr. Locker speak today about an artist whose works grace this collection. And his talk is titled, The Master of the Annunciation of the Shepherds, The Material World of a Mysterious Neapolitan Painter. Thank you, Jesse.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming and for tolerating a talk in English. And thank you also to everyone for showing up online very early or very late. I wanted to thank, so many people have made this happen, but I want to thank the Italian Art Society, the Samuel Kress Foundation, La Capraia, the Museo de Capodimonte, and also some of the same people, but who've been very helpful. Andrea Gamble, who couldn't be here, Kelly Wood for that generous introduction, Sarah Kozlowski, Eike Schmidt, of course, the director of the Capodimonte, Francesca Santaria, and Arlene Lace. So my talk today is entitled, The Master of the Annunciation to the Shepherds, the Material World of an Unknown Painter. One of the great mysteries of Neapolitan painting of the 17th century is the identity of one of its most distinctive painters, whom Ferdinando Bologna gave the moniker, the Master of the Annunciation to the Shepherds, or more properly, Annunciations, plural, to the Shepherds, for their remarkable large-scale paintings in the Birmingham Museum and here in Capodimonte that portray ragged yet dignified shepherds painted with a thick impasto, murky earth tones, and strong contrasts of light and dark. These qualities place him within the circle of the leading painter in Naples, the Spanish-born Giuseppe de Ribera, but his works display an earthiness and brooding monumentality distinctive from those of Ribera. Throughout his work, he sought out subjects that focused on the poor, and especially on shepherds, sheep, and beggars. The Annunciation to the Shepherds, of course, and we have multiple examples, which he repeated often, as well as scrappy philosophers and monks deep in gloomy meditation, and beggar saints, such as Sant'Alessio. And perhaps most astonishing is his portrayal of an artist's studio, a reflection on the painter's craft, which shows the painter as humble as his shepherds and beggars. His world is one of mud, poverty, and gloom, infiltrated only occasionally by a revelation of divine light. So before turning to our main subject, however, we have to address the inevitable question of the artist's identity. And I have to say immediately that my goal today is not to try to solve this puzzle. So I'm sorry to disappoint you if that's why you came here. I won't be offended if you sneak out. Despite a century of proposals from scholars of the caliber of Bologna, August Meyer, Roberto Longhi, John T. Spike, Nicola Spinoza, Viviana Farina, and many others, there's still no consensus as to who the master of the Annunciation to the shepherds might be. So until recently, the most widespread hypotheses have been that he's likely one of two students of Ribera mentioned by the 18th century biographer Bernardo de Domenici, either the Valencian-born Juan Do or the Brindisi native Bartolomeo Passante. But the recent discovery of a signature by Juan Do on paintings that are so different from anything by the master, and I'm sorry for the poor quality of this, but there's a signature, prove, at least to my eye, that he can't be the master of the Annunciation. But documentary evidence also shows that Bartolomeo Passante was born in 1618, moved to Naples in 1629 at the age of 11, worked for an artist named Pietro Beato, and then for Ribera, before dying in 1648 at the age of 30, which would leave little time for a productive, independent career and the kind of stylistic development that the master displays. Recently, Nicola Spinoza has made the promising proposal that the master may in fact be two artists, Pietro Beato, the teacher of Passante, and Passante himself. Beato's known body of work consists of just two possible works. This is the Philosophers from the Prado, and currently in the Spanish embassy in Montevideo, Uruguay. It's not very convenient. It shows some stylistic and thematic affinities with the master, and most promisingly seems to be signed in the book here, Beatus. There's also a Saint Jerome, here are some connections. There's also Saint Jerome in Matera, and this is harder to interpret, but reportedly the initials PB were once visible. Regardless, a 1636 document shows that both Pietro Beato and Bartolomeo Passante lived together in a house belonging to one Ottavio Gena on Via Toledo in the parish of Sant'Anna. And that Passante later married Beato's niece, Angela Formichella. While the introduction of Beato still leaves many issues unresolved, Beato's dates at least fit more comfortably with when the master was active. And the idea of two artists, master and pupil, or maybe pupils, could explain some of the stylistic disparities. The other value of this solution is that it allows us to think of the master as a workshop or a household rather than a single artist, and could help explain repetitions and variations of the same figures and subjects within the corpus of works associated with him. But scholars far more qualified than myself have wrestled with this question for decades. So instead of trying to form another opinion based on the same evidence, I'm content to consider the artist's identity fundamentally unknowable for now, and wish to turn instead to what the pictures themselves can tell us about the painter and his world. I'll focus here on a handful of paintings that give us a range of the artist's characteristic subjects. Today I'm interested in examining what can be gathered about the artist through the material objects represented in his paintings, and what, if anything, they can reveal about his intellectual and artistic life. The research I'm presenting today is part of a larger project examining the material world of artists in 17th century Italy through wills, inventories, and artworks themselves. What do objects artists own signify about the artists who owned them? And what role did they play in artistic production? In paintings by Caravaggio, Artemisia Gentileschi, or Guido Reni, for example, we can trace a single object, such as a bowl, a candlestick, or a painting that the artist owned, and at times these objects can be recognized in inventories and in multiple paintings. But the Master of the Annunciation is a special case in that all we know for certain about him is what's visible in his artworks. Therefore, the humble objects represented in his works take on a more profound significance than they would for another painter, as they are all we have to reconstruct his world. Artists, to paraphrase Michael Baxendall, were foremost tellers of stories, and staging these stories required not just imagination, but objects. Artists needed prints, drawings, and books for reference, plaster casts, furniture, and props, which they often borrowed, traded, and exchanged. A trial document from 1603 records that Orazio Gentileschi lent his friend Caravaggio a Franciscan monk's habit and a pair of swan wings as studio props. And both of these seem to appear in Orazio's St. Francis, supported by an angel in the Prado. A similar pair of swan's wings appear in the first version of St. Matthew, destroyed in World War II, and in the Contarelli Chapel on the young angel on the upper right who leans precipitously off a cloud. Aoife Brady notes that Malvasia says that Guerrini used props for teaching, including braids of hair made of silk, and his inventory lists, among other items, a ruby ring, a gold chain, and a crown in a box, which might be the tiara that's worn both by Venus and by Potiphar's wife in these two paintings. Along with props, hiring live models was also a necessity. Artemisia Gentileschi complained to her Sicilian patron, Don Antonio Ruffo, that the cost of models was intolerable. She also spent a great deal of money on elegant dresses for them, and we can recognize on numerous models. Here, for example, Judith and Mary Magdalene both seem to be wearing the same dress. On the back of a landscape drawing by Bolognese painter Francesco Grimaldi is a revealing list of objects that he had lent to various artists. For example, he lent Andrea Sacchi a book by Giorgio Vasari. Antonio Giorgetti, he lent a relief of a sleeping Puto, and to Pier Francesco Molla, a book of landscape drawings, as well as books, wax figures, and other objects. What would the Master of the Annunciation have required to stage his paintings? What can the choice of objects tell us about the meaning of the works? Let's start with the most modest. In the Annunciation to the shepherds here in Capodimonte, the shepherds have brought with them for their nightly vigil a meager, half-eaten loaf of bread and a fabric bag. In two versions of the same subject, one in a private collection, one formerly at Sotheby's, we see small still lifes in the foreground, consisting of a copper pot, a ceramic pitcher, and a grater or rasp by the embers of a fire. At first glance, these appear identical, but on closer inspection, it seems the artist has rearranged the objects. The pot is better articulated in the Sotheby's version, clearly made of copper and with handles, and it is moved to the right of the fire. The pitcher is at a different angle, suggesting it was not simply copied from the Sotheby's version, but repositioned. And we can see the pattern on the pitcher more clearly. The pot is a fairly standard cooking pot. The rasp or grater could be used for spices, breadcrumbs, cheese, or even making pasta. And the pitcher, seemingly of southern Italian manufacture, seems far too nice for poor shepherds to bring out into the field. But beyond indicating that the shepherds had previously been enjoying dinner, do they mean anything? A similar vessel appears in a painting, current location unknown, formerly in the Direttore collection in Rome. If anyone knows about that, please let me know. By the Neapolitan still life painter Giovanni Battista Europolo, an artist whose father and brother were in fact ceramicists. While the shepherd is lifted directly from Sebastiano del Piombo, is there a reason for the juxtaposition of this kind of southern Italian vocale with shepherds? Is it just a coincidence? More productive is the painter's studio in Oviedo, Spain, whose accumulation of objects provides an unparalleled source for reconstructing the painter and his world. The painter's studio portrays a gray, bearded artist dressed in rags and in the act of painting a sumptuous still life made up of books, a rug, musical instruments, a skull, a candle, a plaster bust, and a musical score. To the left sits a young pupil who practices drawing eyes in red chalk, and in the foreground a small cartellino that reads, "Ancora imparo," I'm still learning. Dressed in the rustic garments favored by his shepherds and beggars, the artist sits before the easel with a look of intense concentration, grasping a maul stick and applying a stroke to the still life on his canvas. In the other hand, he holds a palette and a cluster of paintbrushes. The careful arrangement includes a lute, a viola da braccio, a horn, books, and including a legible music score, a carpet, a marble or plaster bust of a puto, as well as a skull and an extinguished candle. Many of these items can be identified with some specificity. Loredana Lorizzo has convincingly identified the bust as a work by Flemish sculptor Francois Duquesnoy, perhaps a cast of the head of a puto in Vienna or something comparable. Luca Emilio Brancati observed that the carpet seems to be from Anatolia and it would have been a modern type in the 1630s, though the artist has taken liberties with the design. And then there are the books. Domenico Antonio d'Alessandro was able to identify the musical score as Selva Armoniosa, a book of motets by Neapolitan composer Giovanni Vittorio Maiello, published in Naples in 1632. Other pieces of paper that are legible in the painting are telling. In the foreground is the cartellino, Ancora imparo, I'm still learning, and this expression, which has a long lineage, is best known from this popular 1538 print designed by the Tuscan painter and architect Domenico Giuntalori that was represented or reproduced quite often in the 16th century and provides a kind of bitter satire on old age. Finally, the young pupil draws eyes in red chalk, which represent the earliest stage of an artist's training. Ribera produced several sheets of eyes, ears, and mouths in various positions, notably this etching of eyes intended as a tool for students that closely resembles the drawing the young boy works on our painting. There's in fact a lot to work with here, and this is not to mention the master's paintings of astronomers, monks, or his other more ambitious historiae. But here I'd like to turn to two specific types of objects in his paintings that provide particular insight into his works. That is, books and studio models made of plaster clay. Books, of course, formed a fundamental part of any artist's practice. In order to paint, for instance, a subject from Roman history, an allegory, or a scene from the life of a saint, reference books were essential. Artist inventories reveal that most artists possess some books, even if few had impressive libraries. Among the most common books were Vasari's Lives, Cesare Ripa's Cronologia, Vincenzo Cartari's Immagini degli Dei. And books could also serve as props for anyone who wished to paint, say, St. Jerome, Ptolemy, an allegory of vanity, or any other subject that needed to indicate learning. And for these, it didn't much matter what they were. When Ribera portrayed books and paintings, he usually painted squares of gray standing in for blocks of text, as we see here, or sometimes pseudo-Greek letters. The master does this sometimes too. For example, in this peculiar painting, the so-called Greek lesson, the text is actually nonsensical glyphs that don't even look like pseudo-Greek. However, generally speaking, the written word in the master's painting is often legible, precisely inscribed, and selected for its relevance to the subject portrayed. For example, a painting of a philosopher here bears a beautifully calligraphed inscription. And I'll read in English translation, "Today me, tomorrow you. Wherever I am, you will be. The greater the fortune, the less safe it is." Now, this is not sophisticated Latin, but rather a collection of sententiae about the transience of worldly gain. This suggests that perhaps the artist had a collection of Latin maxims, such as an anthology for students or amateurs. This impression is confirmed by the fact that the same inscription appears on another painting in a private collection. A brooding philosopher holding a book with a finely painted title page that says the same thing, but in an entirely different format. Thus, the artist has invented a book that broadly fits the theme of the melancholic philosopher, though it doesn't appear to be a specific volume. In the Sant'Alessio, on the other hand, the carefully inscribed note allows us to identify the artist's source with precision. According to the legend, Alessio, which is Alexius or Alexis in English, lived in mid-4th century Rome, the son of wealthy patricians. They arranged for him to be married, but before it could be consummated, he fled to Edessa, Greece, where he lived an ascetic life among the poor. He returned secretly to Rome, living unrecognized as a beggar under his parents' porch. It was only on his death that his parents discovered him clutching a note that revealed his identity. The note reads, "I am Alexius, son of Euphemianus and Agale, by whom I was married off to a most noble woman and vowed to serve Christ in perpetual virginity." The text comes almost verbatim from the introduction to the Vita of St. Alexius in a 1571 Italian translation of the Golden Legend. The placement, virtually up against the picture plane as he interprets the text, invites us, the viewer, to identify with him, to contemplate the death of the beggar saint, and to decipher the text along with him. This same phenomenon of fingers guiding us through the decryption of a text is seen in the Christ disputing the elders in the National Gallery of Ireland. A young Christ holds a book open, and a number of passages are clearly legible, some with more obvious connection to the subject than others. The first is Isaiah 11, "And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse," no relation, "and a branch shall grow out of his roots, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him." This passage is proof that Christ is the promised Messiah, but also relates to the painter's beloved theme of the Christmas story. On the page opposite is a more puzzling passage, Jeremiah 12. "Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why are those happy who deal so treacherously?" Perhaps referring to the elders who will not accept Christ's message. But I'm especially interested in the script below, framed by Jesus' hand and the shadow of his thumb. It's a paraphrase, slightly misspelled, of John 10:24, apparently from a commentary by John Chrysostom, and it seems to conflate the young Christ in the temple with the episode from years later in the book of John, when the Jews say to the adult Christ, "Tell us plainly if you are the Messiah." Jesus responds to them that, quote, "You are not among my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me." Indeed, the entire chapter of John 10 is a parable of the Good Shepherd and an extended metaphor of the relationship between shepherd and sheep, Christ and Christian. Does this passage help us understand the Master's most characteristic subject, sheep and shepherds? A similar connection between painted texts and the Annunciation of the shepherds can be seen in the open book portrayed in the painter's studio, which is from, as I've mentioned, a book of sacred motets by Neapolitan composer Giovanni Vittorio Maiello. The open page displays a Marian motet, quote, "Blessed is the womb of the Virgin Mary that bore the Son of the Eternal Father, and blessed are the breasts that fed Christ the Lord." Although the artist has adapted the format of the page, cropping the last stanza of the previous motet, the score is entirely legible. The choice of motets is not arbitrary, and its significance becomes obvious once we recognize its source. The text is Responsory 6 for Christmas Matins. Thus, these lines would have been sung during the pre-dawn service on Christmas Day, immediately following Lectio 6, which reads, "The proclamation of the angel to the shepherds who watch their flocks by night in our ears also. And for this end we are appointed to rule the Lord's flock, that we may ever keep in our heart the word revealed from heaven, and to be said unto you, as we do this day, Behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord." In other words, the motet represented in the painter's studio is directly related to the artist's most characteristic subject matter, the Annunciation to the shepherds. More broadly, this and the other examples I've discussed demonstrate the artist's careful attention to choice of painted text, often painstakingly inscribed as a key to unlock the meaning of the works. He also seems to have had a ready knowledge of Scripture, perhaps again through an anthology or through patristic commentary, such as those of St. John Chrysostom. Another painted object that provides insight into the artist's methods and meanings is the plaster head by Duquesnoy in the still life in the painter's studio on the far left. As I've already noted, the head is something like a head of a puto in Vienna, but I should emphasize that Duquesnoy made numerous similar objects in various media. These were small-scale putti, widely disseminated, collected, and copied throughout Europe. Giambattista Passeri remarked in the 1670s that, quote, "Plaster casts of some of Duquesnoy's statuettes are seen in the studios of many painters and sculptors in Rome," unquote, a statement that is confirmed by artist inventories. Flemish painter Michael Sweerts, who spent much of his career in Italy, portrayed casts of Duquesnoy's putti as common studio props, such as this in the studio of 1652 in Detroit. Duquesnoy and Poussin had popularized a new type of puto in the 1620s based on their close study of Titian's Bacchanal of the Andrians, and especially the worship of Venus, now in the Prado. In contrast to the putti typical of ancient Roman sculpture and of Renaissance painters that tended to be around 2 or 3 years old, Duquesnoy's were extremely young, perhaps around 9 months, with chubby arms and legs, dimpled elbows, rounded bellies. They were graceful and agile well beyond their age, and these mischievous little putti became rhetorical figures of sweetness and tenderness, capable of softening the heart of viewers and making them receptive to the work's moral or religious message. Duquesnoy's putti, from the monument to Flemish merchant Ferdinand van den Eyde in the church of Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, were especially admired for their sweetness and effective sorrow, and many artists, including Andrea Sacchi and Peter Paul Rubens, owned copies of them. But the master's engagement with Duquesnoy's putti goes much deeper than this single head. Although it's rarely remarked upon, his baby angels are in fact one of the most characteristic features of his style. Chubby, improbably young, with rolls of fat on their thighs and wrists and rounded bellies. In fact, the putti in both paintings in Naples and Birmingham are closely related to those from the Van Eyden tomb. In fact, the central putto of the Naples painting, for instance, when it's reversed and rotated, as I've done here, is virtually identical to the left putto of the Van den Eyden monument. Likewise, the plaster head portrayed in the artist studio seems to be the precise model for the putto in the Birmingham painting. The use of plaster and clay models in by early modern painters was far more widespread than has been realized, and especially for the representation of babies. The reasons for this were practical. Vasari wrote, "All these objects being motionless and without feeling greatly facilitates the work of the artist because they stand still, which does not happen in the case of living things that have movement." In other words, as anyone who's ever spent time with a baby knows, a baby will not sit still for a portrait, but a plaster baby will. Moreover, a sculpture, as opposed to a drawing, can be reused in various positions, turned around, and studied from different angles. An interesting contrast to this is seen in the adoration of the shepherds in the church of the Pietà dei Turchini here in Naples, generally attributed to the Valencian painter Juan Do, an artist once believed to be the master. The work shares the humble spirit and deep chiaroscuro of the master's work, with the especially affecting detail in the foreground of shepherds presenting a basket of ricotta to the baby Jesus. However, the Christ child presents a strange exception to the earthy naturalism of the rest of the painting. Unlike the chubby, round-headed Duquesnoy putti seen in the master's work, this one is instead doll-like, with rigid arms and legs staring straight ahead. He in fact recalls more closely the polychrome figures by Neapolitan artists like Giovan Bernardo Azzolino, Agnello Stellato, or shown here, Michele Parrone. Regardless, by replacing the angel of the Annunciation to the shepherds with a cluster of tender young putti, the master is at odds with artistic tradition and with the biblical text, which states only that, quote, "an angel of the Lord came upon the shepherds and was then joined by a multitude of heavenly hosts." In doing so, he creates a jarring contrast between the rough shepherds just roused from sleep, huddled around the last embers of the fire or watering their sheep, and the young tender angels who cast an unearthly light on the scene. In these works, it's the hopeful message of the birth of the Messiah that is being conveyed to the shepherds. Thus, the Duquesnoy head, included among the studio props, seems to stand as a sign for the artist's dependence on the Flemish sculpture, for the effective element of his own works, and a nod to the Annunciations for which he's most famous today. The use of clay or plaster models perhaps also complicates the question of naturalism in the master's work. Neapolitan painters, as heirs to the tradition of Caravaggio, were dependent on painting from life, which required hiring models. while some figures seem distinctive and individualized, such as the man with the gray beard who appears as the artist in the painter's studio, or also in the death of Saint Alexius, or also in the Greek lesson, and elsewhere. There's also a younger, muscular, bearded man, often in the foreground, in a state of semi-undress, such as in the Annunciations here at Capodimonte and at Birmingham, as well as paintings such as these, scenes from the life of Jacob and Rachel. However, there are some figures whose reality seems more uncertain. What do we make of the strange bald man with deep-set eyes and angular cheeks who appears in multiple paintings by the master? He appears in Christ Disputing the Doctors, wearing a cap, as well as in the so-called John Duns Scotus in the British Royal Collections, and also in a variant in Poe. Other times he's hatless, revealing a leathery neck and wrinkled brow, usually identified as a saint or a monk, sometimes meditating on a skull, sometimes writing with ink-stained fingers. He even appears in the crowd at the condemnation of St. Lucy, and although his headwear and the angle of his head varies, his expression never changes. Is he a favorite model? A family member? A self-portrait? Or perhaps it's something else entirely? We might take a cue instead from Guido Reni, for example, who famously made a terracotta model thought to represent Seneca, based on a Slav or galley slave, depending on how you translate it, that he saw in Rome, that was widely imitated. Reni used it as the basis for a figure in the Circumcision of Christ in Siena, and in the Adoration in the National Gallery. The recent Ribera exhibition in Paris has proposed that this same terracotta head was the model for this disturbing St. Bartholomew attributed to a young Ribera. The practice of painters using clay models has a long history in the Renaissance. Can we imagine this figure to be based on a terracotta model? Would it have been made by the master himself or by another artist? As we've already seen, his putti are probably not painted directly from life, but from models. In this context, it complicates the idea of naturalism in Neapolitan painting. Writing about the Accademia di San Luca in Rome, Pietro Roccasecca observed, quote, "In order to become a work of art, the artist Invenzione had to undergo a process by which the initial sketch was transformed into a plastic or sculptural model, and then into a finished drawing, complete with light and shadow, and finally into a painting or sculpture." We usually associate such ideas with Roman Bolognese idealist tradition, but inventories and representations show that even Caravagist or realist artists like Orazio Borgiani, Michelangelo Cercozzi, or indeed the master of the Annunciation to the shepherds, owned such models. So rather than focusing on major themes such as theological or theoretical principles, this talk today has intentionally focused on the most mundane objects possible. But for the master of the Annunciation, the supernatural is represented through tangible objects portrayed with special attention, worn and dirty human bodies and the objects surrounding them, ragged costumes, books, pots, rugs, and plaster models that, through artistry, are transformed into something that evokes human experience and emotion, occasionally transcended by the supernatural. Thank you.
I think we have just a few minutes for questions. Do we have another Yeah, bye.
I'll do the icebreaker. So thank you very much for your most interesting talk. Sempre imparo, that is true for us as well. And in fact, as my colleagues in Naples know, I've always had this hunch that the master of the Annunciation of the Shepherds actually might be a woman painter, since we're discovering so many women painters now. And I mean, a little bit hypothetically, I thought she might be called Maria Annunziata, but maybe that is not the case. But now you presented to us actually a prime suspect, which is the niece of Pietro Beato, and considering also the workshop scene, which in a way echoes Michelangelo Cerquozzi's workshop scene of just a very few years earlier, which was published by Elizabeth Cropper and later purchased by the Uffizi. I mean, it is clear that that cannot be a self-portrait, because no arrangement of mirrors could possibly give you that view, but it could be the niece painting her uncle, couldn't it?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and I can't say it's one I've ever thought of, but there is that painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art it's usually considered an allegory of sight, a woman holding a mirror that's by the master of the Annunciation to the shepherds. I believe it's Roberto Contini one time proposed that it could be a painting of Artemisia Gentileschi. I don't think anyone followed that up, but it's very interesting to consider your hypothesis that if it were a woman painter, that allegory would be a place to start.
I still break the ice. I was wondering if you would suggest through that comparison between the Duquesnoy van den Eynden monument and the Putto of the Annunciation, that the master of the Annunciations to the shepherds he was not only Neapolitan painter. Did he had the chance to see something more of Italy or of what other countries?
Yes, so this is a good question and a difficult one, but it does seem that from the point of view of still life, for example, this, if we want to call it the painter's studio, he's painting a type of still life that I don't see any evidence for in Naples until maybe the 1650s or 1660s. There are some Flemish examples, and so perhaps in Rome, maybe he was in Rome and in touch with some of, the Bamboccianti or some of the northern artists. That would be my theory. But again, maybe we're dealing with two painters, one of them who traveled farther. But he does seem, but I should also say there were works by Duquesnoy here in Naples, of course, and perhaps he was looking at some of those too.
Thank you, Jesse. I was wondering if you could say a few more words about the relationship between, props and then leaving space for what we might think of as artist's imagination. Because we're sort of left here partially with this version of Courbet's show me an angel and I'll paint you one, which with sort of show me some swan wings and I'll paint you an angel, right? So if you could just say a little bit more about that relationship. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, that's a difficult question. But, if you were to believe, say, Bellori about Caravaggio and Caravaggism, that they couldn't paint anything if they didn't have it in front of them, their heads remained empty. And that's an oversimplification of Caravaggioism, because obviously there's a great deal of artistry between painting from life and creating a masterpiece. Sometimes we see Caravaggiist painters, I think sometimes works by, say, Cecco del Caravaggio, or early works by Orazio Gentileschi, where they're having trouble with that, where we can recognize it's staged. But I think what's interesting about someone like the master of the Annunciation to the shepherds is that these babies, for example, feel like flesh. Even the heads that's possibly made out of terracotta or something, and, the mastery comes in kind of integrating that, and that is an act of imagination and creativity. And so I think for Neapolitan painting especially, that is kind of the material of what art is. It's quite different, I think, than what Bellori or Bolognese artists and theorists were talking about.
Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you to everyone who joined us online from the Italian Art Society, and thank you all. It was a pleasure. And now we will have un brindisi. Yeah.